This lecture is on the Point Elliot Treaty, specifically the Treaty of 1855. And before we begin, I want to redirect you to the readings and jump back to the list of treaties in this area and kind of talk about the differences between U.S. and Canada. So prior to watching this lecture, you really ought to read the Treaty of Point Elliot, because that's what I'm referencing throughout the entire lecture. And without having read it first, the lecture is going to be a bit hard to understand. So be sure to check out the week 4 readings. Additionally, I want to jump back to this nativeland.ca website. And here I've turned off territories and languages and just turned on treaties. This is pretty cool. You can zoom in and out and see that the Point Elliot treaties, the treaty we'll be talking about, which is one of the Stevens treaties that's really similar to the Point No Point Treaty, and to the south it should be the Medicine Creek Treaty. I'm not seeing it right now, but they're pretty similar languages. And these were the Point Elliot Treaty was signed in 1855. And if we compare that to Canada, we see the Douglas treaties, which were signed about the same time. But we also see the Tsawwassen Treaty. And if you click on this area here, it'll bring you to a few links that we can follow, and we can actually look at the Tsawwassen Treaty. The Tsawwassen First Nation final agreement here was signed in 2007. And so as I mentioned earlier, many of the Canadian First Nations, particularly on the West Coast, do not have treaties, and they've been undergoing this treaty negotiation. And it's worth comparing this treaty to the Point Elliot treaties. And the first thing that's of note is this treaty is still going. This is just the table of contents. Is right there. It says 214 pages plus a number of appendices. So let's see if I can jump to the end here. So let's see, 214 pages plus the appendices. Just for reference, if we do the same thing for the Point Elliot Treaty, follow the link. It's posted on a few tribes' websites, but if we follow Tulalip, brings us here, and another location where we could find the Treaty of 1855. We have 1 page, 2 pages, 2.5. So asking you to read this treaty prior to the lecture is not a huge task. It's shockingly short. And as we'll talk about in the lecture, it's interesting to think about what's actually written and how that's been interpreted, and really the legal ramifications for this treaty, and just to think about, to me, something that's 2.5 pages long, 2.25 pages long, that probably has tens, if not hundreds of thousands of pages written about it, both in court documents and legal briefs and academic literature and everything else. It's just, to me, kind of mind-boggling that so much is hinged on just this really small, really brief document. And we'll come back to some of these, but some of these articles, one sentence is an entire article. Another 1-sentence article. 1-sentence article. It's really, it's remarkable. So the first treaties from about 1774 to 1832 were treaties between individual sovereign American Indian nations and the U.S. And they were negotiated to establish borders and prescribe conditions of behavior between the parties. The form of these agreements was nearly identical to the Treaty of Paris, ending the Revolutionary War between the U.S. and Great Britain. The negotiations ended in a mutual signing pact that had to be approved by the U.S. Congress, and non-tribal citizens were required to have a passport to cross onto sovereign lands. And so this is really a nation-to-nation agreement codifying boundaries and codifying really nationhood as well on both sides of the parties. And so it was a bit different than kind of the way we think about treaties today, and where it's not kind of paternalistic wards of the state, but a nation-to-nation agreement. And the treaties of 1855 follow that as well to some extent. But as you kind of have read the Treaty of Point Elliot, there's lots of things where we can do this to you, we can move you, we can implement these rules. And so there's still this kind of paternalistic approach to the treaties, where the earliest treaties were not that. They were much more focused on nation to nation. However, that's not to say that the first treaties went all that well either. One of the first treaties is the Treaty of Fort Pitt, signed in 1778. This is a treaty with the Delaware tribes, and it gave the U.S. permission to travel through Delaware land. In exchange, the Delaware people would receive housewares and implements of war and not support the British. So the agreement is, if we're allowed to pass through your territory, we'll provide some housewares and implements of war, meaning firearms. In exchange, you will not support the British. Well, within a year, even within a year, that treaty was not upheld. The Delaware people complained that the government was not upholding their end of the bargain. Those complaints were met with their chief being murdered, and the Delaware people ultimately siding with the British. So even in 1778, these treaties were signed, and with no intention of actually fulfilling them. Andrew Jackson led the Indian Removal Act in 1830. This was just a straight removal of people from their traditional territories into territories that the U.S. government didn't want for development, that didn't want to occupy necessarily at that time. And so it was a massive scale movement of people from their traditional homelands to what's now kind of Oklahoma. The Trail of Tears, lots of things have come from Andrew Jackson's Indian removal policies. And later, from 1832 until 1871, American Indian nations were considered to be domestic dependent tribes, and negotiated treaties between tribes in the U.S. had to be ratified or approved by the Congress. And so this is, again, kind of taking that paternalistic approach of the U.S. government and tribes, which are sovereign nations, but having that domestic dependent relationship towards them. Chief among these is the Stevens Treaties. Stevens had signed a fair number of treaties in Oregon, and then wrote and had signed a fair number of the treaties in Washington. In 1853, Oregon and Washington separated from the Oregon Territory. Isaac Stevens was appointed governor and superintendent of Indian affairs of the Washington Territory. During this time, he negotiated 10 treaties, including in Montana and Idaho. And all of these Stevens treaties, the language is pretty similar in all the treaties. And the main objective was to get the tribe to agree to the fewest and smallest amount of reservation land that's non-heritable, that's non-farmable. When you look at the map of reservation areas, keep these few things in mind and kind of go back and look at where these reservations are, and it makes sense that Stevens wanted to get folks to move or agree to move to land that was not going to be useful for farming, because that was the main industry at the time, was agriculture. Settlers coming over wanted acreage to build a farm, as well as the shipment of raw goods out of the territories was really important. Movement of hopefully gold and timber, things like this. We wanted to export. The West was an export economy at the time. So we needed areas for shipping and also the railways coming in at this time. And so thinking about where you put a railroad, where you put deep water shipping ports, and where you would farm. Those are all lands that Stevens wanted to keep and ensure that he was only assigning reservations to areas that were not good for either of those three things, that were not good for farmland, that were not good for shipping, either by ship or by rail. And he knew that tribes would not give up off-reservation fishing and hunting. And they also thought that by allowing off-reservation fishing and hunting, it would be cheaper to feed people, that you wouldn't have to provide as much food. And so there are kind of two thoughts going into it at that point. It's just like the pure economics of like, okay, great, if we let you hunt and fish off reservation, we don't have to provide as much food to you. Secondly, like in the Fort Laramie Treaty, which just got tested with the Crow case about providing hunting access to unoccupied lands, in that case, when they signed away the right to hunt, when they codified the right to hunt elk off reservation, the view at that point in time is that the elk populations are crashing, that market hunting was going to exterminate them. So it doesn't cost us as the U.S. government anything to codify that right. And the same is largely true for salmon. Salmon were a bit different, where they still existed in this mass abundance. And from the government perspective, there's tons of salmon. We're not really at a shortage for salmon. But also at this time in 1855, it's prior to most of the canning operations. And at that time, salmon, prior to canning, had to be salted and barreled, and they weren't really desirable. A lot of salmon was eaten fresh, and it was actually caught by tribal fishermen. They'd come in and sell it at market. And so, it's fine. That's not, in the government's view, it's not something that they're giving up by codifying the right to fish off reservation. In fact, it's, again, providing this benefit by not having to provide as much agricultural products and food to people on the reservation, as well as it's actually providing salmon to the settler population as well, because they'll buy it in the market. There wasn't a big fishing industry here at the time. It had no economic value, so from the government standpoint, giving up something with no economic value was not a big loss. So the Treaty of Point Elliot, signed in 1855, created 3 reservations. The text is really hard to understand because a lot of the names have changed, in particular the place names. But they talk about the Snohomish, which was later the Tulalip tribes, for the Snohomish, Skykomish, Snoqualmie, and Stillaguamish. The Swinomish Reservation for the Swinomish Indian tribal community, Swinomish and Lower Skagit, and then the Lummi Reservation for Lummi, Nooksack, and Samish. And since then, things have changed. The recognition of a tribes, additional tribes, has come up. Some of which have reservation lands, some of which do not. So it's changed a fair amount from 1855 to what the tribal landscape looks like today, including a number of tribes that have fought for federal recognition and not received it. One of which is the Nawaha, which is kind of Bow area, Skagit, lower Skagit area. So this is a map of from Gibbs of 1855, which I show here because it helps understand some of the place names, and they've really changed through time. For example, what they call Perry's Island, we now call, it's probably hard for you to read, but it's Perry's Island, which is what we now call Fidalgo. And so they talk about the Swinomish Reservation in relationship to Perry's Island, and it gives some of the other tribal names. Samish really center here, Lummi, Nooksack, Swinomish, Snohomish, a few others, Duwamish. So it's interesting to see these place names and kind of how they've changed. Zooming in a bit more, so here's the Swinomish Reservation, Lummi Reservation, which does not include Lummi Island. And on this map, it's interesting. This is the Lummi Peninsula. This is a tumbelow, or a stretch of intertidal to just above tidal land that connects to another island or another body of land. This is Portage Island. Here it's kind of drawn all as one. And so reading through the treaty and kind of interpreting what these articles mean, Article 3 is to create an agriculture and industrial school, and also boundaries can be altered by the president. So the agriculture and industrial school, the goal at the time was to train Native folks in the way of agriculture and industry. And so this is that providing tools to assimilate local populations effectively, right? So the intent was that you could change indigenous groups from and have them give up their practices that they've been practicing since time immemorial and become farmers and laborers. The way that's interpreted today, though, is it's been interpreted is still funding for schools. And so based on Article 3, there's still set funding for educational opportunities on reservation. And those look a fair amount different. There's still funded trade schools, but there's also other programs like Northwest Indian College, a bachelor's granting institution on the Lummi Reservation that provides 4 bachelor's degrees. And so there's kind of a wide variety of the way that's been interpreted. There was an aquaculture training school out there, and there's some construction trades and some other programs out there as well, in addition to Lummi having their own K-12 school system. And so the interpretation of Article 3 has changed, but it still does provide additional educational opportunities to folks on reservation. Article 4 was just that after signing the treaty, folks have 1 year to move to the reservation. Article 6 talks about payment of $150,000 over a few years, and that's about $4.3 million in today's dollars or nominal dollars, so not a whole lot. And the funds are to be used at the discretion of the Indian agent. And so there's a designated person to be in charge of the reservation. And we're supposed to use these funds to help develop the land, to provide infrastructure and housing and things like this. They were typically widely misused, and almost none of those funds actually made it into the community or were to anything resembling what they were supposed to be meant for. Article 7 said that the president can move you, they can combine reservations or alter boundaries. So again, here's the reservation lands, the outlines, but we can also just sign something and move you somewhere else. And in some of the Montana examples, that was actually done up until very recently, that the boundaries were often altered. In fact, another example of that is for uranium mining on the Navajo reservation, that the boundaries were moved by the president so they can access uranium ore that we were extracting at the time to build nuclear weapons, to fight World War II. After we've obtained enough uranium, then those boundaries were moved back. The open mine pits leaking uranium were then returned to the Navajo people with no cleanup efforts. So this movement of boundaries has happened for quite a while all across tribal country. I don't know of a lot of local examples, but it certainly has been implemented in other places. Article 9 and 10, or don't harm people or property off reservation. Conflicts between tribal members will be settled by the government. Don't drink or possess liquor. And if you do, the president can determine how long to withhold annuities or how long to withhold payments. Article 12 and 13, I thought this was pretty interesting. No trade with, they call it Vancouver's Island, but no trade with Vancouver Island, and no foreign native allowed to reside on the reservation. So that's really interesting to think about, that line between U.S. and Canada being put up, and they're saying no First Nations can reside on the reservation, when this could be, like, quite literally your brother, sister, mother, father, child being a member of that First Nation on the Canadian side. Now, per the law, they're not allowed to live on a U.S. reservation. I don't know how much that was enforced, but there was they did not want people crossing the border very much. And they were also given about $15,000 to clear the land for agriculture. So Article 14 is going to support for 20 years for agricultural school, industrial school, and providing medical care. And again, those are still in place today. There's a medical, it's called Indian Health, but there's medical provided both on reservation, and there's urban centers in Seattle. And other tribes have contract health services where they'll pay your copay, or you have an allotted amount you can spend every year on medical care. And if you're a member of a federally recognized tribe, you can go to a medical care facility on a different reservation and get service. And so that's still upheld today. And then Article 5 is the big one. So the right to fish at usual and accustomed grounds and stations is further secured to said Indians in common with all citizens of the territory, and of erecting temporary houses for the purpose of curing, together with the privilege of hunting and gathering roots and berries on open and unclaimed land, provided, however, they shall not take shellfish from beds staked or cultivated by citizens. So there's a few things in here, and actually, like I mentioned, obscene amounts have been written about this. And this is really the core of what we'll discuss here about the Boldt Decision and the later fishing decisions about this, is that the right of taking fish in usual and accustomed grounds, interpreted as places that you fished and hunted and gathered prior to contact. Those are usual and accustomed areas. In most kind of tribal parlance, that's often referred to as UNA, usual and accustomed. So Lummi has a UNA, Tuatha has a UNA, Swinomish has a UNA. Usual and accustomed fishing grounds, areas on the map where it's been interpreted as places where people can go and fish under Article 5 of the Stevens Treaties. Okay, so that's the first part. You can hunt and fish or take and fish in your usual and custom areas. is secured to said Indians in common with all citizens of the territory. Citizens of the territory, i.e. non-natives, so they're allowed to, the tribes are securing the treaty right to be able to fish in their usual areas in common with citizens of the territory. So this is not saying that tribes have the exclusive access, nor is it saying that citizens, settlers, and others have exclusive access. This is saying that it's going to be accessed in common with treaty tribes and citizens of the territory. And this last line is, provided, however, they shall not take shellfish from beds or staked or cultivated. So that would be interpreted as today. If you're a member of a treaty tribe, you can't go down to Taylor shellfish and start grabbing oysters off the line. That's not allowed. We'll talk about the graffiti and kind of what that's opened up as well. So this article again has been like the most interpreted piece of the whole treaty, and there's some kind of earlier history, but working up to what's called the Fish Wars, which were the 60s through 70s, of people, of tribal members practicing their inherent right. I think we talked about this before, but if not, there's a big distinction between inherent rights and treaty rights. So as a member of an indigenous group, you have inherent rights that come with your membership, your blood, that you are a part of a community, you're a recognized member of that community, and with that you have inherent rights, as in like inheritance, like that come to you from your lineage. And treaties are protecting a subset of those inherent rights. Sometimes they're called acquired rights or retained rights. I think retained rights might be a better way of thinking about it. So the treaty rights are a subset of inherent rights that are codified or retained in the treaty. So folks were, the way that Article 5 had been interpreted up until the Boldt decision is that folks have the right to fish on reservation. Their rights do not extend beyond the reservation, despite that being codified in Article 5, which states that you can fish in the usual and custom areas in common with the Washington State Department of Fisheries and the local police enforced you can only fish on reservation. Now, if you think about where a lot of these reservations are, there's no streams returning to these reservations, so there's not a large ability to access fish, and it cuts out a lot of the traditional fishing that would have been out in the islands, and so it drastically reduces your ability to catch fish. And if you moved off the reservation to try to catch fish, it was actually very violent, very bloody, and you can see that the rhetoric of the time is a bit charged, let's say. Skagits on the warpath, meaning Skagit tribal members, in an Indian fishing dispute. And so this is, the Indians, have been crowding us, and they were talking about threats back and forth. Shots were common. So here the Game Commission confirmed that 2 Indians were arrested for net fishing on Christmas Eve. Were found to have 15 steelhead and 7 salmon and a 100-foot mesh, 100-foot net that they're fishing on the Skagit River. So here's a couple of tribe members going out to fish on Christmas Eve to have fish for Christmas. They're fishing on the Skagit River off the reservation, but clearly within their usual and custom areas. And then they're arrested for catching a few fish, 22. And this started getting more national attention. Marlon Brando came out, was kind of famously arrested with folks doing protest fishing where they would go out and fish kind of with the intent of getting arrested. The National Guard came in. It was really a really high conflict. There was a lot of tear gas, rocks, shots fired, people getting beat up. And one of the people that were really leading this fish war was Billy Frank. And the issue that Billy Frank and others were leading from the Puyallup tribe and other tribes is that some of their family fishing areas were off the reservation, where their family had homes, where they had been given property that they legally owned. They were not allowed to fish in the river right there. And so they would go out and fish and get arrested. And I think Billy talked about being arrested more than any other Washington native. And this would go on and on and on. And what finally happened was somebody came out from the federal government to observe this. And it was a conflict between Puyallup and other treaty tribes and Washington State Fish and Game, the state police, really beating natives going out trying to fish. And the federal government saw this, and a lawsuit ensued. And it was actually, it's called the Boldt Decision, but it's actually U.S. v. Washington. And so the federal government was suing the state of Washington because the state of Washington was not upholding this treaty agreement. So the treaty is a federal law. It supersedes local and state law. And here the state government stepping in and saying, no, we're going to ignore that federal law, that treaty, and we're going to implement our own law that is infringing upon that treaty right. So the lawsuit actually wound up being U.S. v. Washington. It was overseen and decided by Judge Boldt, and so it's often called the Boldt Decision. And the Boldt Decision decided that Article 5, to fish in common with, equaled 50%. So he said, if we're fishing in common, if we have something in common, that doesn't mean you get 95% and I get 5%. In common means we share it equally. And so he decided that to fish in common with meant that treaty tribes are allowed half of the resource and non-treaty fishers are allowed half. That's in common with. And usual and custom areas were to be determined based on historical documentation and being able to prove where your people were prior to contact. And so in your usual and custom areas, you're allotted half of the available fish. This caused a big uproar, but ultimately resulted in co-management and the system we have now, that without that decision, then co-management would not be possible. That co-management, meaning that tribes and state and feds all work together on managing the resource, in this case salmon, only happens because tribes have a major seat at the table. They have half of the available resource. So it's been pretty pivotal decision. This is a video by Lisa Cook. She's a Lummi tribal member, graduate of Northwest Indian College.
In U.S. v. Washington, 1974, the Boldt Decision, Judge Boldt mandated that a fair share meant 50% of the harvestable fish destined to pass the tribe's usual and accustomed fishing places, and reaffirmed tribal management powers. A significant point that played a key role in the Boldt Decision was the use of the language from the Point Elliot Treaty in 1855. One pivotal phrase was usual and accustomed fishing grounds. This phrase was taken from Article 5 of the treaty. The area that it refers to is on and off reservation areas where Indians usually fished and were accustomed to fishing there since time immemorial, before the white man came. This was important because it was an acknowledgement that Indians fished in other places besides the reservation. To fish in common with meant sharing equally in the Indian treaties, and this decision, in common with, meant sharing equally the opportunity to take fish at usual and accustomed grounds and stations. Therefore, treaty fishermen shall have the opportunity to take up to 50% of the harvestable salmon catch. The Supreme Court upheld U.S. v. Washington in 1979. Lummi had many heroes that devoted their lives to protecting treaty rights. Florence and Forrest Dutch Kenley were two tribal members that were influential in the Judge Boldt decision. Their most enduring contributions and accomplishments on behalf of Lummi people were their roles in presenting the legal case and issues of United States versus Washington, leading to the Boldt decision. In 1973, testimony depositions of Forrest Kenley were identified as farmer and fisherman. It was a case of new and old documents, of past and present, and of changing times. Not many know that the oldest voices of the Lummi were witnesses before Judge Boldt. More than 25 affidavits from Lummi fishermen, chiefs, and leaders from the 1895 case of United States versus Alaska Fish Packing Company were introduced as evidence and exhibits for the Boldt case. From Point Roberts to the San Juans, from reef netting and purse seining to the old fish traps and wheels, a century's history of Lummi River, shore, and marine fish harvesting and management, including new strides in aquaculture, was placed in evidence before Judge Boldt. Florence and Dutch were also instrumental in the development of the Northwest Indian Fish Commission. Florence was the first secretary for the Fisheries Commission. In 1962, Dutch was elected chairman of the Interim Commission. Dutch also served as its first official chairman for the first 3 years.
Our backbone is our salmon. As he always says, it's the most important thing is the air that we breathe. If it wasn't for the fish, there would be no Lummi people.
Civic to the snatch of Lummis and sea, and the Charlie to see him. Arkansas and of Lummi Charles and Squall, it is Puchil, it is Squall. Queen sa Ashkuts Numpats, Salok Asla, it is Squall. Hawk, what's a snub, Church Salok Asla, it is Squall. We had the census quail, it's a snap, it's a salalo, just kind of heaps, no, Xala Sivanama. So you do squail, that's in this Chahena Kutia squail. It's a salalo, it's a treaty. Just giving you a few words in the language to kind of inspire you as to who you are and where you come from. Don't forget who you are and where you come from.
The research that I have conducted has not only made an impact on my capstone, but it has also touched me personally. I set out to answer my question of who in Lummi were our Billy Frank Jr.'s. I now know who in our tribe fought for our fishing rights and sacrificed themselves by going to jail and writing letters and signing petitions and learning how the court systems worked in order to obtain legal assistance in the fight to uphold our treaty rights. This for me has been a very healing journey and has inspired me to continue with my work in preserving our history for our future generations. I was very humbled and overwhelmed when I came across my grandmother's transcript, and hearing her voice for the first time in more than 35 years was very emotional for me. This is another sign in my research that proves to me that I am on the right path, and I am doing the work that is vital to protect our way of life. This work is not only academic, it has been a soul-searching adventure as well. I cannot stress enough how important that this work is to me. I know that I am exactly where the Creator has guided me to be, and I know that it will be my legacy that I leave behind.
You see, the Indians fished. They caught fish for their eats. That's why they had to live by the river.
I wish to dedicate this work to my father, Reginald Rusty Wilson, who taught me how to fish when I was 5 years old and instilled in me a great work ethic. He taught me how to be a strong Native woman and educated me on the importance of salmon to our people and the significance of the Judge Boldt decision. I know I am the person that I am today because of his teachings of treating people with love and respect and the importance of family. To him, I will be forever grateful. Dad, I love you more than a million sockeye.
College and now works for the Lummi tribe. I'm going to pause here and queue up this video, and I'll put the link in the additional resources for this week as well. So post Boldt, Boldt really dealt with salmon. That, as you read the text again, it's the right to fish. It's about collection of fish. It's not necessarily, the right of taking fish, usually on custom grounds. Now, what is a fish? What does fish mean? At the time, it was really a fight over salmon. It was interpreted as such. Once that was won, then the next question was, well, in 1855, if you translated with a member of the Samish, Swinomish, Lummi Nation about fish, that really meant everything out of the saltwater. It meant salmon, it meant halibut, it meant crab, it meant clams, it meant seaweed, it meant shrimp, it meant octopus. But the Boldt was interpreted to just really apply to salmon. And so the next lawsuit was about opening up that and defining fish in the way that it was defined when the treaty was signed by those who signed it. Meaning, not how do we interpret the word fish today, but how is the word fish interpreted by a signatory of that treaty, a native signatory of that treaty. And so it was later called the Treaty Decision. It often is called Boldt II, but it happened in 94, and it was decided that a fish is a fish is a fish, meaning that the word fish is interpreted to mean everything out of the sea. And it was sort of interesting that there was this dichotomy and difference of weight given to different types of testimony. So if you had an anthropologist during the court case, anthropologists would come in and they would say, well, I've interviewed tribal elders and they say that fish, they would use the word fish to describe crab, or their grandma would use the word fish to describe crab. That's taken as expert testimony and it's given the highest ranking in the evaluation of the available evidence. During the same hearing, they would have elders come in and the elders would say, when my grandma would say fish, she could be referencing a crab or she would be referencing a clam. If she would say, we're having fish for dinner, we might have crab. So she used the word fish to mean everything out of the ocean. That was called, that was not given the same ranking. That was called, it was lay testimony, and it wasn't given the same ranking. It was more or less kind of hearsay. It was not taken with the same weight of evidence as that same information coming from an anthropologist. So it was a bit frustrating for the folks involved that their own words, their ancestors' words, were not given power unless they were repeated by an anthropologist, somebody with a PhD, this kind of thing. It was a bit interesting about how it worked out. But in the end, it was ruled that the same 50% rule applies to harvestable shellfish on western Washington beaches, with the exception of artificial beds. So it's the same thing that you can't go to Taylor and take clams off their clams that they've planted. However, and the aquaculture industry was freaked out about this. However, you would have access to half of what was there prior to that farm being put in. This means that in Washington, as we mentioned in the Canadian versus U.S. lecture last, that if somebody privately owns the tidelands, if they put oysters out, you wouldn't have access to that. But if any naturally recruiting, any naturally occurring clams and oysters, treaty tribes would have an access to that. And this also include clams, oysters, crabs, shrimp, geoduck, sea urchins, and sea cucumber. And these later ones we'll talk about wind up being extremely important, to me, shockingly important. And so there was, again, a big blowback from this, particularly from the aquaculture industry and the non-native crab fishers, this fear that if you allow indigenous people back into these fisheries, everything is going to get depleted and it's going to cause a lot of conflict. And then later, particularly working with the aquaculture industry, they came to an agreement that tribes will forego their treaty right to harvest on an estimated $2 million worth of naturally occurring shellfish beds that are now commercial aquaculture facilities. So meaning where Taylor is in Sandwich Bay, if Taylor wasn't there, there'd be shellfish there. People who go harvest. Now it's not there. And so in exchange, the growers will provide over 10 years, $500,000 worth of shellfish enhancements on public tidelands of the state's choosing, and a trust for tribes to be able to acquire and enhance their own tidelands. And this has been used whenever land from a DNR lease comes up. Because again, Washington State Department of Natural Resources controls the tidelands and subtidal. If there's an aquaculture lease that's not being used and it comes up available, a lot of the tribes will then go in and lease that land, tying up for their exclusive access. And so those funds have been used that way. On the fisheries economy, it's had a really big impact. So this decision was in 94. And if we look at, this is a graph of Dungeness crab landings. What that means is the amount of crab that were caught and then reported. And it goes from 1980 to 2004 in thousands of pounds. And so if we look back here in the early 80s, there was some tribal commercial harvest, but very minimal compared to recreational harvest, people just going out and buying a fishing license, which was even less than the state commercial harvest. Now something changed again here in 94 into 95, that the amount of crab being harvested for tribal commercial greatly increased. And if you kind of compare this plus this equals about that, right? So it's about 50-50. It's supposed to be 50-50 between tribal commercial and the combination of state commercial and state recreational. So the state has access to half of the crab. They need to decide how they're going to allocate that between commercial and recreational fishers, and that's a source of conflict. But tribes have their access to half of it. Now that's really allowed them to engage in the fishery. Prior to that treaty right being upheld, as a treaty fisherman, you could buy a license from the state to go crabbing, just like anybody else that walks up off the street could do. We'd still have to pay a fair amount of money to do it. This opened it up where folks could go out and crab. And most of the crabbing fleet tend to be smaller boats. They tend to be, the typical crabbing boat is a like 1980s 22-foot fiberglass boat that was a pleasure boat where the top's been cut off, a new deck's been put in, and an outboard's been put on it. So an old pleasure craft that's been rebuilt with the motor on the back, a little, what they call a doghouse, which is like a phone booth cabin in it, and then a winch on the side to pull up crab pots. And you would run 20, maybe 50 crab pots. Not a big operation. These aren't like, this isn't Deadliest Catch with these like giant boats. This is like really small scale, little skiffs. One person can run them. But it's opening up that fishery to folks to engage in on a small scale, where prior you had to buy a permit, and those permits can be $250,000. So you have to pay $250,000 to take your, dinky little 20-foot boat out that combined is maybe worth $5,000-$10,000 to go out to fish 10, 15 traps. Like you'd never be able to pay that off. But now it opens up that access where folks can go out with a relatively small boat, go out by themselves, and still harvest crab at a high enough rate to put some food on the table. And it can either be done as a full-time, or a lot of folks have a full-time job and then they'll crab on the weekends, or they'll take a week off here and there and go crabbing. And so it makes it where it's not an all or none, right? Like you can still engage in the economics of it, in the practice of it, without having this massive, kind of insanely high cost to buy one of these commercial crab permits. And it's resulted in a major part of the fisheries economy for the Lummi Nation. So these are the value of landings. So again, landings are fish that are caught, that are brought in this case, to market. And what's their value? And this is their value in millions of dollars. And so this tops out at just under $7 million. And it has a different, I'll move me here, has the different species down here: crab, sockeye, manila clam, chinook, which is a type of salmon, chum, type of salmon, sea cucumbers, coho, again, a type of salmon. And you can see in the bottom here are crab. And some of these years, here, 2006, crab is maybe half, but look at 99. Crab represents probably 90 some percent, 80 some percent of the overall fisheries income for the entire tribe. Even on years where other things did well, it's still a major, major, major economic resource. Additionally, it's a major economic resource when things are bad. Like you can see here, looking at really, so Chinook can be good sometimes, sockeye, when they're abundant, there's a fair amount of money in it, but as salmon populations decline, those numbers are going to continue to decline. And really, what you think of as the major, treated fisheries, salmon really aren't the most economically important fisheries. It's the Raffiti fisheries: crab, sea cucumbers, sea urchins, gooey duck, which aren't on here, are increasingly more and more and more valuable. And so the Raffiti fisheries really support the bulk of the economic fisheries. This is for Lummi, but it's true for many of the other tribes as well. Additionally, crab is spread out, where salmon only really return kind of in the fall. So the timing of that's really tight, right? It's during a certain time of year. Crab, there's openers throughout the year, including winter openers, where you can go out and crab just around Christmas. Around a lot of the holidays, they'll have an opener so folks can go out, catch some crab, provide some money right around Christmas, which is handy. And also there's usually a market for it because most of the crabs are sold fresh. And so around holiday times, people buy crab for celebrations and things. Additionally, that crab money also comes early in the year, and that's the money that helps rebuild the boat motor, to buy new nets, to buy new crab pots. And so that little bit of money is really important about when it comes. And so coming out of the Boldt decision and then into the Raffiti, from an economic standpoint, Raffitis, from a fisheries value standpoint, Raffitis the most important. Boldt is obviously around salmon has resulted in a massive amount of restoration. The culvert case and other cases forcing the state to uphold their end of the bargain, interpreting habitat degradation as an impact on the treaty right. And so the Boldt decision is actually, the initial fear was that the Boldt decision would be the end of salmon. that if we allow these natives to go fishing, they're going to catch all the fish. Well, what's happened is that because now salmon populations are part of a treaty right, the tribes can go in, leverage the state and the federal government for not upholding that agreement by building roads that cut off access to small streams for salmon to spawn in. And for degrading the habitat, they can hold the state's feet to the fire and say, what you've done here, you've degraded the habitat, which has decreased the salmon populations, which is an infringement on our treaty right. So therefore, you need to go back and fix it. So in actuality, I think without Boldt, our salmon populations would be doing much worse than they currently are, and the situation would be a lot more dire. That because of that treaty right, tribes are able to not only have a seat at the table, but have a big tool to wield to improve habitat and access for salmon to spawn in, to ensure that resource to continue on for us all. So it's interesting how, again, just like these two little lines, the way that they've been interpreted through time has changed. The amount of court cases around it, the amount of strife and fighting around it, and how just those few lines have really, really made a big impact on both what all of our environment looks like now, right? Like the salmon restoration work is going on for all of our benefit, because we share these resources in common. And it all comes back to this little document that's barely 2 pages long. And I think it's just pretty remarkable. And it's a really good thing to have read that treaty, to understand what's in that treaty, and that you have to think about reading this major legal agreement. It's going to be huge, and you can just read this in a few minutes. It's quite impressive. So for this one, I'm not going to ask you what the individual articles mean. It would be good to know a bit about why the reservations were put where they were put. That they were trying to find lands that didn't have any farming or shipping values. Be good to know what the Stevens Treaty is. It would be good to know a bit of the verbiage in Article 5. Know what the Boldt Decision is. Know what the Treaty Decision is. And a bit about kind of the economic valuation of fisheries. So with that, Heishka, thank you.